There are 15 million people in the San Francisco Bay Area, one airport, one BART system, one bridge system connecting a city built on the northern tip of a peninsula with nowhere inland to run, and beneath them, the San Andreas Fault, 750 miles of locked tectonic boundary that last ruptured in 1906 and has been loading stress ever since. 4 million people in Portland, 3 million in Seattle, 2.5 million in Vancouver, all of them living within reach of the Cascadia Subduction Zone, the 700-mile fault offshore that has produced magnitude 9 earthquakes and the tsunamis that follow them. The last one, on January 26, 1700, sent waves across the Pacific that arrived in Japan with enough force to be recorded in historical logs. These two systems, San Andreas and Cascadia, are the two most dangerous fault systems on the North American continent, the two most studied, the two most planned around. Emergency managers have spent decades designing response frameworks for each one. Billions of dollars spent on early warning systems, seismic retrofits, evacuation routes, hospital resilience programs. Every single one of those plans assumes one fault moves at a time. On May 2, 2026, Oregon State University published a peer-reviewed paper in the journal Geosphere that changes that assumption permanently. Marine geologist Chris Goldfinger and his team spent 27 years drilling sediment cores from the seafloor at the point where Cascadia and San Andreas meet, the Mendocino Triple Junction off Northern California. What they found in those cores is the geological record of synchronized rupture. Cascadia moves. And then, minutes to hours later, the northern San Andreas moves in response. It has happened at least 3 times in the past 1,500 years, including in 1700. And here is where the data becomes genuinely alarming. Goldfinger said it directly in the published press release. Quote, "If they both went off together, you've got San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver all in an emergency simultaneously." The emergency management system that was built to handle one catastrophe at a time has never been designed for that sentence. Before we begin, hit like and subscribe to Global Faultline so you don't miss updates as this continues to develop. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And tell me this: San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver simultaneously. Every federal disaster response resource in the country needed in 4 cities at once. Is there a plan for that? Drop that in the comments. Let's get into it. The Federal Emergency Management Agency operates on a fundamental assumption that is built into every response protocol, every resource allocation model, and every mutual aid agreement in the United States. Disasters happen in one place at a time. When a major earthquake hits San Francisco, FEMA draws from resources in Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and the federal stockpiles. Urban search and rescue teams from Seattle fly south. Medical surge capacity from Portland hospitals absorbs overflow. The National Guard from states that were not affected surges into the affected zone. This is the mutual aid system. This is how the response works. Now run the Goldfinger scenario. Cascadia ruptures. A magnitude 9 earthquake shakes the Pacific Northwest. The ground in Seattle liquefies in places. The bridges across the Willamette River in Portland fail. The coast of Washington and Oregon receives a tsunami within 15 to 30 minutes. Hospitals in the impact zone are simultaneously managing structural damage to their own buildings and a mass casualty event that overwhelms every bed they have. FEMA activates. Urban search and rescue teams mobilize. Resources begin flowing north from California. Oregon and Washington National Guard units activate. And then, minutes to hours later, the northern San Andreas ruptures. The resources that were flowing north toward Cascadia are now needed south for San Andreas. The California National Guard that was preparing to send units north is now managing its own emergency. The hospitals in San Francisco that were preparing to absorb overflow from the Pacific Northwest are now receiving their own mass casualty event. The mutual aid system that every response plan depends on requires that somewhere there is a place that was not hit, a reservoir of capacity, a functioning node in the network that can absorb the demand from the affected node. Goldfinger's paper documents that the geological record shows these two systems can eliminate that reservoir simultaneously. San Francisco and Seattle in emergency at the same time. The country's two most resource-intensive disaster response operations running in parallel, competing for the same federal assets, the same military lift capacity, the same emergency medical supply chains. An initial quake along the Cascadia Subduction Zone would draw down the resources of the whole country to respond to it, Goldfinger said. That was describing one fault. Now double it. To understand how two fault systems 100 miles apart can rupture in sequence within minutes to hours, you need to understand what Goldfinger's team found on the seafloor, and how they found it by accident. In 1999, Goldfinger and his team were drilling sediment cores from the Cascadia Subduction Zone off the coast of Oregon and Northern California. A navigational error took them off course, about 55 miles south of Cape Mendocino, into the San Andreas Fault zone. They decided to drill anyway. What came up in that core stopped them. Sediment cores from earthquake zones contain layers called turbidites, deposits laid down by underwater landslides triggered by seismic shaking. Normal turbidites have a predictable structure: coarser sediment at the bottom, fine-grained sediment on top. The coarse material settles first. The fine material drifts down slowly afterward. That is the signature of a single shaking event. The core from the Mendocino Triple Junction had the opposite pattern: fine-grained sediment at the bottom, coarse sandy material on top. A doublet, two separate events stacked on each other. The fine-grained layer at the bottom, a Cascadia rupture. The sediment that settled first during Cascadia's shaking was fine-grained because Cascadia's signature in that location produces that texture. The coarser layer on top, the San Andreas rupture that followed. Coarser material, different composition, deposited shortly after. Think of it like two glasses of sand being poured into the same pool of water, one after another. The first glass settles. Then the second glass hits. The layers stack on top of each other in the sediment record, separated by the time between the two events, which the researchers could measure within the limits of radiocarbon dating. Over 27 years, Goldfinger's team drilled cores at multiple sites north and south of Cape Mendocino. They compared the turbidite layers across locations. They found these doublet deposits appearing repeatedly through 3,100 years of geological history, too consistently to be coincidental, too structurally specific to be explained by other mechanisms. The Geosphere paper documents at least 3 instances in the past 1,500 years, including the 1700 Cascadia rupture, where the two faults moved within minutes to hours of each other. The mechanism Goldfinger proposes is seismic coupling. The stress released by a Cascadia rupture propagates through the crust to the northern end of the San Andreas, which sits less than 100 miles away at the Mendocino Triple Junction. That stress transfer is not hypothetical. It is the documented physical process of Coulomb stress transfer, the same mechanism that explains how one fault rupture loads adjacent segments with additional stress. In Cascadia's case, the adjacent segment it loads is the northern San Andreas. The physics does not require the faults to be directly connected. They are not. They are separate systems with separate geometries. What they share is proximity to the same tectonic stress field, and 3,100 years of sediment cores, showing that when one of them breaks, the other follows. At approximately 9 o'clock in the evening on January 26, 1700, the Cascadia Subduction Zone ruptured along its full length. The earthquake lasted between 3 and 5 minutes. It was, by geologic reconstruction, a magnitude 9 event. The shaking was experienced from Northern California to Vancouver Island, and within hours, a tsunami crossed the Pacific and arrived on the coast of Japan, where it was recorded in historical documents that remain in the archive today. Japanese officials noted the arrival of large waves from a distant source at a time corresponding to the January 26th rupture. The date of the Cascadia earthquake is known to within hours because of those Japanese records. What happened to the San Andreas in the hours after January 26, 1700 is now in the geological record of the Mendocino Triple Junction cores. The doublet deposit corresponding to 1700 shows the same structure as the other synchronized events. Cascadia's fine-grained signature at the bottom, the San Andreas coarser signature on top. Two systems, minutes to hours apart, on the same night. Here is why 1700 is the most important data point in Goldfinger's paper. 1700 is the most recent full-margin Cascadia rupture in the record. It is the event that FEMA, USGS, and every West Coast Emergency Management Agency uses as the reference scenario for their Cascadia response planning. The Shake Alert early warning system was designed around the 1700 magnitude as the likely recurrence of the next full Cascadia event. The 1700 planning scenarios do not include a simultaneous San Andreas rupture. The sediment cores say they should. Every Cascadia response exercise that has been conducted, Cascadia Rising in 2016, the annual state-level exercises, the federal planning documents, models a single fault event. The resource drawdown is catastrophic in those models. Multiple studies have projected that a full Cascadia rupture alone would produce 13,000 deaths, 27,000 injuries, and damage exceeding $30 billion in Oregon and Washington alone. Those numbers assume California is intact and able to help. Here is the specific gap that Goldfinger's paper exposes in every emergency management framework on the West Coast. The response plans are sequential. Cascadia ruptures, FEMA activates Region 10, covering Oregon and Washington. Region 9, covering California, becomes the primary donor region, the source of mutual aid flowing north. The federal government has pre-positioned resources and pre-written resource allocation protocols that operate on the assumption that Region 9 is functional and available. The Geosphere data says that assumption may not hold. If Cascadia triggers a northern San Andreas rupture within minutes to hours, Region 9 activates simultaneously. San Francisco's bridges, the Bay Bridge, the Golden Gate, face a repeat of the 1989 Loma Prieta scenario, or worse, depending on the magnitude. The BART tunnels under the Bay face liquefaction risk. The hospitals in the Bay Area, which are designated receiving facilities for mutual aid, during a Cascadia response become immediate patient-generating facilities themselves. The military airlift assets at Travis Air Force Base in California, a primary logistics hub for Pacific Coast disaster response, are now managing simultaneous demands from two catastrophe zones in opposite directions. Goldfinger named this explicitly. An initial Cascadia quake alone would draw down resources from the whole country. Now the resources from California are unavailable. The logistics of a coordinated response to a simultaneous dual fault event do not currently exist in any federal or state planning document on the West Coast. This is not speculation. It is a documented gap between what the planning assumes and what the geological record says is possible. The paper uses the term partial synchronization, not guaranteed simultaneous rupture. The three documented instances in 1,500 years represent a minority of total Cascadia events. Most Cascadia ruptures in the record do not show evidence of a corresponding San Andreas response within the same depositional interval. The probability of synchronization on any given Cascadia rupture is not quantified in the paper. The mechanism is documented. The frequency is not yet characterized with enough precision to assign a probability. What the paper establishes is that the scenario Goldfinger described, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver in simultaneous emergency, has happened before, in the geological record, in 1700, and likely twice more in the preceding 1500 years. The question the paper cannot answer is when. It can only say that the category of event exists, has precedent, and is absent from every planning framework currently in operation. This is Global Faultline. On May 2nd, 2026, Oregon State University published a peer-reviewed paper in Geosphere documenting 27 years of seafloor sediment core analysis from the Mendocino Triple Junction, the point where the Cascadia Subduction Zone and the northern San Andreas Fault converge off Northern California. The paper documents at least 3 instances in the past 1,500 years, including the 1700 Cascadia rupture, where the 2 fault systems ruptured within minutes to hours of each other. The mechanism is Coulomb stress transfer, the documented physical process by which a rupture on one fault loads adjacent fault segments with additional stress. The data source is turbidite deposits in seafloor sediment cores, the geological record of underwater landslides triggered by seismic shaking. The findings are peer-reviewed. The lead author, Chris Goldfinger, is a marine geologist at Oregon State University who has been analyzing this data since 1999. The emergency response plans for Cascadia and San Andreas operate on the assumption that one fault moves at a time. That assumption has not been updated to reflect this paper's findings. 15 million people in the Bay Area, 4 million in Portland, 3 million in Seattle, 2.5 million in Vancouver. Each city has been planning for the earthquake that comes for them specifically. None of them has been planning for the scenario where the earthquake that comes for their city happens in the same hours as the earthquake that comes for the others. The mutual aid system that connects those cities, the resource sharing network, the federal response apparatus, the military logistics, the hospital surge agreements was designed for sequential disasters. It has never been stress tested against simultaneous activation at both ends of the West Coast. The sediment cores at the Mendocino Triple Junction say it is not just possible. They say it has already happened. The geological record is there. The doublet deposits are measurable. The radiocarbon dates are documented. The question is not whether 2 fault systems that have synchronized before can synchronize again. The question is whether the emergency management framework that protects tens of millions of people along the West Coast will be updated to account for the geological record before the geological record repeats itself. This analysis is based on the peer-reviewed paper published in Geosphere, Volume 21, Issue 6, published in 2025, authored by Chris Goldfinger and colleagues at Oregon State University, and the associated press release published May 2nd, 2026, through Science Daily and Oregon State University News. All quotations attributed to Chris Goldfinger are sourced from those official publications. This does not represent a prediction of future seismic events. If you are watching from San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, or Vancouver, drop a comment. Tell me where you are. Tell me if your city has a plan for the scenario this paper describes. And tell me this, the geological record says Cascadia and San Andreas have moved together at least 3 times in 1,500 years. The last time was 1700. The emergency management plan for the next time doesn't exist. Does that feel like a gap worth closing? Drop that in the comments. I read every one.